The first sound Reuben Sutton heard when he crested the ridge above the Carson Valley Trail was not the wind, not the distant call of a hawk riding thermals above the Sierra Nevada, and not the dry rustle of sagebrush along the switchback. It was the sound of a woman weeping, raw and unguarded, the kind of crying that a person only allows themselves when they believe no soul in the world is close enough to hear. The year was 1873, and the trail that wound down from the high country toward the settlement of Genoa, Nevada Territory, was not a gentle path. It was a rutted, sun-baked stretch of earth that had broken wagon axles and mule spirits alike, a road that demanded everything from those who traveled it and offered very little in return. Reuben had walked it 100 times, maybe more. He knew every stone, every dry gulch where flash floods could appear without warning, every place where the ponderosa pines thinned enough to allow a man to see for 20 miles in 3 directions. He knew this trail the way other men knew their own parlors, which was fitting, because the high country was the only parlor Reuben Sutton had ever truly owned. He was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders in a way that made his buckskin coat look like it had been stitched from a pattern designed for someone larger, and then adjusted to accommodate a man who kept outgrowing expectations. His arms were thick with muscle built not in any gymnasium, but through years of felling timber, hauling elk quarters down steep mountainsides, and wrestling canoes through white water on the Truckee River. His hair was dark brown, nearly black, and it hung past his collar in waves that he managed with a strip of rawhide when he was working and let fall loose when he was not. His jaw was strong and square, shadowed always with a beard that never fully committed to being neat, but never descended into chaos either. His eyes were the particular shade of gray-green that the Carson Valley sky turned in the hour before a summer storm, and they had that same quality of stillness before movement, watchful, measuring, quiet. He came around the bend in the trail with his pack mule, a disagreeable animal named Talbert, following behind him on a lead rope, and he nearly walked past her. She was sitting at the very edge of the trail, where the ground dropped away into a shallow ravine, filled with scrub oak and bitterbrush. She had her knees drawn up to her chest and her face pressed into her folded arms, and her whole body was shaking with the effort of grief she was clearly fighting to contain. Her dress was pale blue calico, travel-stained at the hem, and her dark hair had come loose from its pins to fall around her shoulders in tangled waves. A small carpetbag sat in the dust beside her, its clasp broken, and a few items, a folded handkerchief, a small mirror, a leather-bound book had spilled from it onto the trail. Reuben stopped. He did not call out to her. He did not ask what was wrong, or announce himself, or do any of the things that a less perceptive man might have done in that moment. He simply looked at her for the space of a breath, read the language of her body the way he read weather signs and animal tracks, and understood that this was not a woman who needed noise. He tied Talbert's lead to a nearby juniper branch, walked to the edge of the trail, and sat down beside her in the dirt. He said nothing. He did not touch her. He simply sat, his large frame settling into stillness beside her, his elbows resting on his knees, his eyes moving out across the valley below where the afternoon light was turning the sage silver, and the distant peaks of the Pine Nut Mountains were going purple at their bases. He was close enough that she would feel the warmth of him, close enough that his presence was undeniable, but he made no demand of her. He simply was there. For a long moment she did not react. Then her crying slowed degree by degree, the way a storm moves through and the rain lessens before it stops entirely. She lifted her head and looked at him with red-rimmed eyes that were dark brown, almost black, and wide with the particular shock of a person who had believed themselves completely alone. She was young, 24 or 25 at his best guess, with a face that was handsome in the way of women who had lived through something fine-boned and expressive, with a mouth that looked like it was built for strong opinions, and a complexion that the trail sun had bronzed to a warm honey tone. Even swollen from crying, she was striking, and Reuben noticed this the way he noticed things quietly, without making any performance of it. "You sat down," she said, her voice rough from tears. "I did," he said. "You did not say anything. Figured you had enough going on without me adding to it." She stared at him for a moment. Then, to her own evident surprise, she made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a sob. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth and took a shuddering breath. "Charlotte Ramsey," she said finally, as if introducing herself was the most ordinary thing to do after being found weeping alone at the edge of a mountain trail. "Reuben Sutton," he said, and he extended his hand, and she shook it with fingers that were still trembling slightly. "Are you headed to Genoa?" she asked. "Eventually." "I am not in particular hurry." "I was," she said, and her voice caught on the word. "I was in a hurry. I was supposed to be there by this morning. I had a stage connection." "Stage doesn't run again until Thursday," he said. "It's Tuesday." She closed her eyes briefly, and he watched the grief move through her face like a wave. "I know," she said. "I know that now." He waited, and because he waited and said nothing more, she told him. She had been traveling from Sacramento, California, where she had spent the last 3 years working as a school teacher in a small church school on the edge of the city. She had come west from Ohio 2 years before that on the promise of a teaching position, and the hope of something larger than the life she had known. Her father had died the previous winter, and her older brother, who had been the family's anchor in Sacramento, had himself relocated to the Nevada territory 6 months ago to try his hand at a silver claim in the Comstock region. The letter she had received from him 3 weeks ago had been brief and urgent. He was ill, consumption the doctor believed, and he wanted her near. So Charlotte Ramsey had gathered what she owned into a carpetbag and a small trunk, arranged passage, and come. The trunk, she told Reuben, was gone. The wagon she had hired from Carson City had hit a washed-out section of road in the night and gone sideways in the dark, tipping into the ravine below the first switchback. The driver, a man of no particular reliability named Holt, had righted the rig and continued, but her trunk, the one with her books, her winter clothing, the letters from her father, everything she had kept was still somewhere at the bottom of that ravine. Holt had refused to stop and retrieve it. They had argued. She had taken her carpetbag from the wagon bed and gotten out, telling him she would walk the remaining miles to Genoa. He had driven on without looking back. "And then I sat down," she said, "and I could not seem to stand back up." "That happens," Reuben said without judgment. She looked at him sideways. "You are a very unusual man. I have been told. Most men on this trail, finding a woman alone, would have—" She stopped and looked back at the valley. "I know what most men do," he said. "I am not most men." There was a silence that was not uncomfortable. A hawk drew a slow circle overhead. Talbot stomped his feet at the juniper branch and made a sound of profound personal offense. "That is your mule?" Charlotte asked. "That is Talbot, yes. He sounds unhappy. He always sounds unhappy. He is deeply opposed to standing still." Reuben stood and brushed the dust from his trousers. "I am going back down to that first ravine to find your trunk. If it went in on the right side of the road, it will have hit the ledge about 15 feet down and stayed there. If it went left, it may have gone further." He looked at her. "Can you walk back to the ravine, or would you rather stay here with Talbot? He is disagreeable, but he is not dangerous." Charlotte Ramsey got to her feet in a single motion that told him she had more spine in her than the last hour might have suggested. She picked up her carpetbag, shoved the spilled items back inside and tucked the broken clasp as best she could and said, "I will walk." They went back down the trail together, Charlotte keeping pace beside him without complaint. Despite the loose-soled boots he could hear slapping against the hardpan. The ravine where her trunk had gone over was exactly where he had calculated it would be, a sharp outside curve, where the road had eroded badly, leaving a crumbling lip of earth above a 10-foot drop to a wide ledge before the slope continued another 40 feet down. The trunk was on the ledge, one corner cracked open, resting at a slight angle against an outcropping of granite. Reuben examined the slope, found a reasonable route, and descended without drama, moving with the easy confidence of a man who had spent years navigating terrain that discouraged ordinary men. He reached the trunk, checked its weight, tested the handles, and then worked it up the slope by increments, bracing his legs against the granite and using his arms in a controlled, powerful motion that brought it back over the lip of the ravine in about 15 minutes of concentrated effort. Charlotte was standing at the edge, watching. When the trunk came over, she grabbed one handle without being asked, and together they carried it to a flat section of trail. "Open it and check," he said. She knelt and worked the latches. The lock had sprung from the impact, but the lid had held mostly closed, and while some clothing was disarranged and one book had a crumpled cover, nothing significant was lost. She found the packet of letters from her father near the bottom, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, entirely unharmed. Her hands went to them gently. She did not cry again, but Reuben could see from the set of her jaw that it cost her something not to. "I can rig this trunk to Talbert's pack frame," he said. "If you can manage your bag on your own. It will add weight, but he can carry it. Genoa is 4 miles from here. We can make it before dark. You were heading to Genoa anyway." "Near enough. I need to visit the trading post. I can go through town without much trouble." "You were not planning to go through town," she said, and it was not a question. He looked at her, and there was something in his expression that was not quite a smile but moved in that direction. "No," he said, "I was planning to cut south and go around, but plans adjust." She held his gaze for a moment. "Thank you, Mr. Sutton." "Reuben," he said. "Reuben," she agreed. They went the 4 miles as the sun descended toward the peaks, and Reuben matched his stride to hers, and did not push ahead the way a man in a hurry might. He pointed out the places along the trail where water had last run, showed her the tracks of a mule deer and 2 fawns in the dust of the road's shoulder, and told her where the spring was that travelers used when the trail was dry. He did so not in the manner of a man performing knowledge for an audience, but in the quiet way of someone who thought aloud when the company was good enough to warrant it. Charlotte listened and asked occasional questions that were precise and intelligent, and told him she was paying genuine attention. She was from eastern Ohio, she said, from a valley where the hills were green and gentle and nothing in the landscape had ever tried to kill you, which made the West an ongoing adjustment. She had adapted because she chose to adapt, because Charlotte Ramsey was, at her core, a woman who met the world with her chin level. Her father had taught her that. He had been a schoolteacher himself, and a man of quiet dignity who had believed completely in the power of an education to transform a life, and she had inherited not only his profession but his conviction. "Your brother," Reuben said at one point. "The Comstock claim. Is he working it alone?" "He had a partner when he started, a man from Missouri named Delacroix, but I believe the partner left in the spring. Thomas is—" She paused. "Thomas is stubborn. He would not leave the claim even when he started coughing. He says the vein is close." "There is always a vein that is close," Reuben said. "I have never met a miner who did not believe that." "Is that cynicism or experience?" "Experience," he said. "I trapped through the Comstock region for 2 winters. I have watched men ruin themselves over rock." "And what do you do now? Just walk trails with your mule?" He heard the gentle teasing in it and answered it with equal lightness. "I have a cabin up above the valley. I trap in season. I bring goods to the trading post and take back what I need. In the summer I sometimes guide parties through the high country, miners looking for new ground or survey teams. It is not a complicated life." "It sounds like a free one," she said, and something wistful moved through her voice. "It is," he agreed. "That is why I keep it." They reached Genoa as the last orange light was fading from the sky and the first stars were pressing through the darkening blue above the eastern range. Genoa was the oldest settlement in the Nevada Territory, a small and weathered town that sat at the base of the Sierra Nevada like a man leaning against a wall. It had a main street with a hotel, a saloon, a trading post, a small church, a blacksmith, and a collection of houses that ranged from solid to precarious. It smelled of sawdust and horse and the particular dry sweetness of the high desert sage that pressed against its edges. Reuben brought Talbert to the livery at the edge of town and arranged for both the mule and Charlotte's trunk to be held there. He walked her to the hotel, a two-story frame building with a porch that sagged at the west end, and went inside with her to make sure the clerk, a narrow-shouldered man named Peck, gave her a proper room without making difficulty about the fact that she was a woman traveling alone. Peck looked like he might make some comment and then looked at Reuben and reconsidered. Charlotte got her room and her key. She turned to Reuben at the bottom of the stairs, and he could see in her face the complex layering of exhaustion, grief, gratitude, and something else, something that was not quite shyness but moved in that direction when she looked at him directly. "I do not know how to properly thank you," she said. "You did not have to do any of what you did." "No," he agreed. "And yet you did." "You needed someone to sit with you first," he said, "and then someone to get your trunk. I was there for both." He said it simply, without drama, and she seemed to understand that he meant it simply, which made it land more heavily than any elaborate speech could have. "Will you be staying in Genoa?" she asked. "A night or two. I need to do business at the trading post and pick up some provisions." "Perhaps," she said carefully, "I will see you before you go." "I think it very likely," he said. He left her there, and went to see about provisions and a place to sleep. And Reuben Sutton, who had spent the better part of 31 years preferring the company of mountains to the company of people, walked back out into the cool Nevada evening thinking about the precise color of Charlotte Ramsey's eyes. The next morning Reuben was up before the sun, which was not unusual, and he was at the trading post when Emilio Garcia unlocked the door at 6 in the morning, which was exactly how Garcia had expected to find him because Reuben Sutton always came first. He traded his winter's worth of beaver and marten pelts, which were late season but still good, and acquired flour, salt, coffee, dried beans, a new skinning knife to replace the one he had snapped last October on a frozen carcass, and 3 books, because the one thing Reuben Sutton spent money on without hesitation was books. Garcia, who had known Reuben for 5 years and conducted this same general transaction every season, always set books aside for him. This time there was a surveying manual, a collection of essays by a man named Emerson, and a novel by Mr. Charles Dickens that Garcia had taken in trade from a lawyer passing through. He was loading his provisions when Charlotte appeared on the street, and the sight of her in the morning light, hair properly pinned, color better in her face, moving with the purposeful stride of a woman who had slept and recovered her bearings, made something in his chest do something he was not entirely sure what to do with. She was heading for the doctor's office, a small clapboard building at the end of the main street. He fell into step beside her without being asked. "Did you sleep?" he asked. "Adequately. The room is clean, which is more than I expected." She glanced at him. "You." "I stayed at the livery with Talbot. He is less disagreeable when he has company." She stopped walking and turned to look at him, and he could see she was not sure whether he was serious. "In the livery." "I sleep outside most of the year," he said. "A livery is practically luxurious." "You are a very unusual man," she said again, but this time there was warmth in it that had not been there the day before. At the doctor's office she gathered herself on the porch before going in, and Reuben waited without being told to, simply leaning against the porch post because it seemed like the right thing to do. She was inside for 20 minutes. When she came out, her face was composed, but the composure was the kind that is built over grief rather than being the absence of it. "Thomas is worse than his letter said," she told Reuben. "The doctor here in Genoa has seen him twice this week. She pressed her lips together. He cannot work the claim anymore. He needs to rest and have proper care, and he is not going to survive the winter at the camp." "Is there family anywhere?" "Our mother died when we were children. There is an aunt in Cincinnati, but she is elderly and they were never close." She looked out at the street. "He came here with everything he had and the claim has not paid. If he sells it, there is barely enough to cover his debts at the assay office." "How much does he need?" Reuben asked. She looked at him sharply. "I am not asking you for money, Reuben. I know you are not. I am asking how much he needs." "I do not know exactly." "The doctor says if Thomas stays here in Genoa, at the hotel with proper meals and medicine, he might have a chance. It would take months, most likely, and I would need to find work. There is a school, Reuben said. I noticed the schoolhouse. It has been without a teacher since spring. The woman who ran it went back east to care for her own sick mother. Charlotte turned to look at him fully. How do you know that? Garcia at the trading post knows everything that happens in this valley, Reuben said, and he talks freely to people who listen. Did you ask him about the school this morning? Reuben looked at her steadily. I may have mentioned you were a school teacher. She was quiet for a moment, and he could not read exactly what moved through her face, something complicated and warm and slightly overwhelmed. You looked into that for me, she said. Garcia is on the school committee. He would be the man to speak with. This morning, before you even knew I was coming to ask the doctor those questions. I had a general sense of where the questions would lead, he said. Charlotte Ramsey looked at Reuben Sutton for a long, considered moment, and something shifted between them in that look, something that had been moving slowly since the moment he sat down beside her in the dirt without saying a word, and was now a little further along the road toward wherever it was going. I will go speak with Mr. Garcia, she said. I will walk with you, said Reuben. The meeting with Garcia went well. He was a broad, cheerful man in his 40s, with a gray-streaked mustache and genuine enthusiasm for the school, which had been his particular civic passion for a decade. He asked Charlotte several questions about her training and her experience in Sacramento, listened to her answers with the focused attention of a man who knew what he was looking for, and by the end of the conversation had offered her the position at a salary that was modest but not insulting, with a small house attached to the back of the schoolyard that teachers had traditionally used. Charlotte accepted. She shook Garcia's hand and thanked him, and when they stepped back out onto the street she let out a long, slow breath that had a great deal of the last several days compressed inside it. All right, she said. All right, it is possible. It is possible to make this work. Thomas should come to town, Reuben said. I can go to the camp and bring him down in the wagon if you can arrange for the hotel to take him on credit for a week until you are established. You would do that. Go out to the camp and bring him in. It is not far, I know that ground. She stopped on the sidewalk and looked up at him. He was considerably taller than she was, and she had to tilt her chin up to meet his eyes, and her expression was something he had not seen on her face before, something unguarded and grateful in a way that was different from relief, something that was personal rather than situational. Why are you doing this? She asked quietly. Truly. Reuben considered the question. He was not a man who spoke carelessly, and he took the time to find the true answer. Because yesterday you were sitting at the edge of a trail with everything falling apart, he said, and you still shook my hand and told me your name like you intended to keep going. I respect that, and because he stopped, because she pressed, because I would like to know how it turns out, he said. She held his gaze for a moment, and the honesty of that answer clearly reached her in some way she had not expected, because she looked away across the street and he could see a small private smile at the corner of her mouth. Then I suppose you will have to stay around long enough to see, she said. Reuben went out to Thomas Ramsey's mining camp the following morning with a borrowed wagon from the livery. The camp was 8 miles northeast of Genoa, in a dry canyon that smelled of sulfur, and had the exhausted look of ground that had been worked too hard. Thomas Ramsey was 29 years old and had the look of a man who had once been strong and was currently fighting a losing argument with his own body. He was tall like his sister, with the same dark coloring and the same stubborn jaw, and when Reuben introduced himself and explained the situation, Thomas looked at him with the measuring look of an older brother who is not entirely sure what to make of the large mountain man who has come to collect him. Charlotte sent you, Thomas said. It was partly a question and partly not. Charlotte knows I am coming, Reuben said, which was accurate but slightly different. Thomas coughed, which ended that line of inquiry, and began to pack his few remaining possessions. Reuben helped him break down the camp, and he watched Thomas through all of it, the way the man's color went gray with exertion, the way he breathed carefully between efforts, and he was grimly glad that Charlotte had arrived when she did and not a month later. On the drive back to Genoa, Thomas said, after a long silence, "She is not the type to need saving, my sister." "I know," Reuben said. "She will not appreciate anyone treating her like she is." "I know that too." Thomas looked at him sideways. "And yet you went and got her trunk out of a ravine." "She needed her trunk." Thomas made a sound that was possibly a laugh and possibly a cough and leaned back against the wagon seat. "She told you about father. She mentioned him. She took it hard. She always thought she had more time." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "I think she came out here half to help me and half because she did not know how to sit still with the grief." "She is good at moving forward," Reuben said, "even when it costs her." Thomas Ramsey studied Reuben Sutton for a long moment with his sister's same dark eyes, and whatever he saw seemed to satisfy something in him, because he nodded once and settled more deeply into the wagon seat, and did not say anything more that required an answer. Charlotte had arranged a room at the hotel for Thomas, and the doctor came that same afternoon to examine him properly and prescribe a course of rest and a medicine that the trading post could compound. Thomas was installed in a warm room with a proper bed and a window that looked onto the main street, and Charlotte sat beside him for an hour while he ate his first real meal in weeks. Reuben waited on the hotel porch because that seemed to be where he ended up waiting outside of things that were hers alone, near enough to be useful. When she came out, the strain in her face had eased somewhat. "He is going to try," she said. "The doctor thinks if he truly rests and eats properly and stays out of the canyon air, he has a reasonable chance." "Stubborn men often survive things they have no business surviving," Reuben said. "He said the same thing about me," she replied. Reuben smiled then, fully, which was a rarer thing than most men managed, and looked, on his particular face, unexpectedly warm. Charlotte's breath seemed to catch slightly at it, though she recovered quickly. "I start at the school on Monday," she said. "I looked at the house today. It needs cleaning and some repairs to the roof on the east side, but it is livable." "I can look at the roof," he said. "Reuben, you do not have to. I have nothing else to do for 2 days," he said. "And I am better on a roof than most. It is not a favor, it is just something that wants doing, and I am available to do it." She looked at him with an expression that was fond and faintly exasperated. "Is that how you justify everything? It wants doing." "It is a useful philosophy," he said, "and after the roof is done. After your provisions are packed and your business at the trading post is finished." The question sat in the air between them. He could hear what was under it, not demanding, not clinging, just honest. "What then?" "I will go back to the cabin," he said slowly. "I have traps to reset and a season to prepare for, but the cabin is not so far. A day's ride." "A day's ride," she repeated. "I have come through Genoa before," he said. "I expect I will come through again." "I see," she said. And then quietly, "I would like that if you did." He looked at her for a long moment in the evening light that was turning the street to amber. "Then it is settled," he said. He fixed the roof on Saturday, working from early morning into the afternoon, and Charlotte was inside the house most of the day, scrubbing floors and washing windows and making the small house habitable by sheer force of will and strong lye soap. She brought him coffee at mid-morning, climbing the ladder herself to hand it up to him, which he had not expected, and she stood on the top rung and watched him work for a moment with an expression she probably did not realize she was wearing. He was aware of her eyes on him, the way a man is aware of sun on his face, warmly, and without needing to name it. He took the coffee and they talked for a few minutes about inconsequential things, the angle of the roof, the quality of the shingles Garcia had provided, whether the chimney would draw properly in winter, and underneath all of it there was the current of something else entirely. That evening he ate supper with Charlotte and Thomas in the hotel dining room, and Thomas, who was sharper in conversation than his exhausted body suggested, steered the talk toward Reuben's history with a practiced subtlety that was probably not as subtle as he believed it to be. Reuben answered honestly, because he did not see the point of anything else. He had grown up in Missouri, near Independence, in a family of 7 children that had struggled through drought and crop failure, until his father had gone west with a fur company when Reuben was 14, and never quite came home in spirit even when he came home in body. Reuben had followed at 17, because the East felt like a room he was always about to grow out of. He had trapped and guided and prospected and built his cabin above the Carson Valley with his own hands over the course of one winter, using a plan he had drawn himself on brown paper and a methodology he had largely invented as he went. "No family?" Thomas asked, in the way that meant something more specific than the general question. "None close," Reuben said. "Not in the way you mean." Thomas ate his soup without visible satisfaction but with evident intent. Charlotte was looking at the tablecloth with the expression of a woman who was deciding whether to be embarrassed by her brother or not. "Charlotte has not had much cause to trust people in the last few years," Thomas said. "I say this not to speak against her but because it is relevant." "Thomas," Charlotte said, with a particular warning inflection. "I am merely providing context," Thomas said mildly. "You are doing something quite different from providing context," Charlotte said. Reuben looked at Thomas directly. "I am not a man who moves fast at anything," he said, "and I do not say things I do not mean. If that is the context you are looking for, that is it." Thomas nodded, apparently satisfied, and returned to his soup. Charlotte looked at Reuben, and the expression on her face was somewhere between mortified and grateful, and Reuben found both of them charming in equal measure. He left Genoa on Sunday morning. He stood with Talbot on the main street in the early quiet, his provisions loaded, his winter goods secured, and Charlotte walked out to say goodbye in her ordinary dress with her hair still down, which he suspected was because she had come out quickly and not had time to pin it, but which meant he saw her the way he had the first time, with her hair loose around her shoulders. Except now it was morning and she was not weeping and everything about the picture was different, and yet the same essential thing lodged itself in him with equal force. "Safe travel," she said. "I will," he said. He paused. "I will try to come through before the first snow if I can." "First snow comes early up here," she said. "Garcia says October, sometimes September at the high end. Then I will try for September." She held his gaze. "I will be here," she said. "I am not going anywhere." He gathered Talbot's lead and he was 3 steps down the street when she called after him. "Reuben." He turned. "Thank you," she said, "for sitting down." He looked at her for a moment in the pale morning light, and something opened quietly in his chest that he had no particular word for but recognized as something he had not felt before, at least not in this form, not with this particular quality of certainty and tenderness combined. "Good luck with the school," he said, and he went up the trail into the mountains. The next 2 months were the most occupied and the most strangely restless that Reuben had spent in years. The work was the same: trapping, maintaining the cabin, laying in the provisions and firewood that would carry him through a high-country winter. He expanded his trap line east of the ridge, which required him to be out most days from before dawn until late afternoon. He repaired the cabin's south wall, where a winter storm had weakened the chinking. He shot a bull elk in early September and spent 3 days processing the meat, which gave him enough dried and smoked venison to last 4 months. All of this was the ordinary rhythm of his life, and he was good at it, and it satisfied him in the way that competence satisfies, and yet something was different. He found himself reading less in the evenings, which was unusual, and sitting outside more, looking down through the pines at the distant lights of the valley below. He caught himself composing sentences in his head, things he would say to Charlotte if she were there, or things he was curious to know about her, questions that had surfaced during the days when there was no one to ask them. He noticed this happening and did not resist it, because Reuben Sutton was a man who trusted himself to know the difference between foolishness and something real, and this did not feel like foolishness. He came down the mountain to Genoa in the 2nd week of September, 14 days before the first serious snow dusted the upper peaks. He brought with him, in addition to his usual trading goods, 3 pounds of fresh pine nuts he had gathered from the pinyon stands above his cabin, because he had a specific and detailed memory of Charlotte saying, when they had passed a pinyon pine on the trail, that she had never eaten pine nuts and they sounded interesting. Garcia greeted him at the trading post with the satisfied expression of a man who had correctly predicted an outcome. "School is going well," Garcia said, without being asked. "She is a good teacher. The children like her. She has already fought with Councilman Barrow about the curriculum and one which has endeared her to approximately half the town." "Only half," Reuben said. "Barrow still has his supporters," Garcia said philosophically. Reuben completed his trading and then went to the schoolhouse, which was in session. He stood outside and listened for a moment to Charlotte's voice through the window, clear and firm and animated, leading a group of children through what sounded like a geography lesson about the Mississippi River Basin, and the pleasure he took in simply listening to it was acute enough to tell him something definitive about the state of his own heart. He waited until the school day ended and the children ran out into the yard, and Charlotte appeared in the doorway to watch them go, and she saw him immediately because he was, in fairness, not easy to miss 6 feet 2 inches of mountain man leaning against the fence post with a paper sack of pine nuts. Her whole face changed when she saw him. Not dramatically, she was not a woman who did things dramatically unless the occasion demanded it, but the change was there, vivid and real, a warm light moving behind her eyes. "You came," she said, walking toward him across the yard. "September," he said. "I said I would try for September. You did say that." She came to a stop in front of him, close enough that he could see the small details, a chalk smudge on her left wrist, the fact that she had a pencil tucked behind her ear, the slight asymmetry of her smile that he had been thinking about, he realized, more than was strictly necessary. He held out the pine nuts. "You said you had never tried them." She looked at the bag and then up at him, and whatever was in her expression made the 14 days on the mountain feel entirely worthwhile. "You remembered that," she said. "I remember most things," he said, "but I remembered that particularly." They walked to the small house behind the schoolyard together, and she made coffee on the stove. The cabin was tidy and warm, and had the particular character of a place that a specific person lived in, with stacked books and a piece of dried wildflower pressed into a glass on the windowsill. And they sat at the table and talked for 3 hours the way people talk when they have been waiting to talk to each other, and the time has finally arrived. She told him about the school, about the 12 children who attended it, about Councilman Barrow who had objected to her including natural history in the curriculum, because he felt it was insufficiently practical, about Thomas who was improving slowly but measurably, eating more and breathing easier and complaining louder, which the doctor said was a good sign. She told him about the woman next door, a Norwegian widow named Ingrid Sahlberg, who had brought Charlotte a loaf of bread on her first day and become something approaching a friend, and about the way the valley looked in the early morning from her bedroom window when the mist was still rising off the meadows. He told her about the elk and the trap line and the books he had read, and she asked pointed questions about all of it, particularly about Emerson, and they had a genuine argument about one of the essays that was spirited and mutual, and ended with both of them slightly more interested in the other's view than they had been at the start. He stayed in Genoa 2 nights that time. On the second evening, he walked with her along the edge of town where the sage began, and the sky above the Sierra Nevada was a deep violet studded with more stars than seemed physically credible, and they were not quite touching as they walked, but the inches between them had a quality all their own. "I thought about you," she said, as a plain fact rather than a confession. "I thought about you," he said, which was the most direct he had been. She was quiet for a moment. "What does that mean, do you think, for a man like you? A man like me?" He was genuinely curious about how she had him sorted. "A man who has chosen to live alone on a mountain," she said, without judgment in it. "A man who is very complete on his own, who clearly prefers it most of the time." "That is accurate," he said. So what does it mean that you thought about me? He stopped walking, and because he stopped, she did too. They turned to face each other in the starlight, and he could see her clearly even in the dark, the pale oval of her face and her dark eyes, and the way she was looking at him with the honest directness that he had liked about her from the very beginning. "It means," he said carefully, "that I am beginning to think that alone was a circumstance, not a preference, or that it was a preference that has been revised." Charlotte Ramsey looked at him for a long moment, and in the quiet desert night with the coyotes calling distantly from the sage flats, something settled between them, not concluded, not declared, but settled, like a foundation being laid. "I am going to be here for some time," she said. "Thomas needs a year at least, and the school, I find that I want to see it through. I want to know those children until they are older." "That sounds like Genoa is becoming yours," he said. "Parts of it," she agreed. "The school certainly, Thomas. Ingrid," she paused. "You possibly, if you keep coming back through." "I will keep coming back through," he said. "Then I suppose we will see what that adds up to," she said, and her voice was quiet and certain and warm, and Reuben Sutton, who had spent a decade being unmoved by the things that moved other men, felt as moved as the land must feel when the seasons turn, thoroughly, in every direction, all the way through. He rode back up the mountain the next morning, and this time the restlessness went with him because it was a different kind now, not absence but anticipation, which was a better kind to carry. He came through Genoa 6 more times before the end of October, each visit stretching a little longer than the last, each conversation covering more ground and going deeper into it. He met Thomas properly, and they developed a gruff, straightforward rapport built on the shared recognition that both of them said what they meant and meant what they said. He helped Ingrid Sahlberg repair her fence after a particularly insistent mule from the livery leaned through it, which won him significant approval from that quarter. He sat in on one afternoon of school when Charlotte was teaching the older children about the geography of the Nevada territory, using a hand-drawn map she had made herself, and he found himself watching her more than the map and understanding, during that hour, something about what it meant to be good at a thing you loved. In November, the snow came in earnest to the high country, and Reuben could no longer make the trip down the mountain without 2 days of hard travel through drifts. He had known this was coming. He had been, in some ways, preparing for it, extending his visits, making sure that the last one before the serious cold set in was long enough to matter. The last visit in October, the one that preceded the first real winter storm, he stayed 4 days. On the 3rd day, in the afternoon when the children had gone home, and the schoolhouse was empty, and the first gray clouds were building above the Sierra Nevada peaks in the way that meant snow in the high country tonight and in the valley by tomorrow, he and Charlotte stood on the schoolhouse steps and looked at the sky together. "You have to go tomorrow," she said. It was not a question. "Before the storm comes through," he confirmed. She nodded slowly. "How long?" "If the winter is hard, February at the earliest." "March more likely. 4 months." He could see her calculating it. "The mail rider comes through every 2 weeks until January," she said. "After that it gets uncertain." "I know. I will write when I can and hope the letters get through." He paused. "I have never written many letters." "I have written a great many," she said. "I find them easy, easier than talking sometimes." She glanced at him sideways. "For most people." "Not for me," he said. "Talking is easier when I have something to say." She looked at him with that direct, full attention. "And do you have something to say before the snow?" Reuben turned to face her on the steps, and he was deliberate about it the way he was deliberate about most things, and she stood still and let him be, which was one of the things he valued most about her. She did not rush anything. "Charlotte," he said, "I am 31 years old and I have been, in most respects, a man who does not expect to be surprised. And then I came around a bend in the trail and found you sitting at the edge of it, and every week since then I have found myself surprised." He paused. "I am not a man who speaks about his feelings easily or often, but I am also not a man who waits past the last good moment to say a true thing. So the true thing is this: I am in love with you." I have been moving toward that understanding since September, and I have arrived at it completely. I want you to know it before the winter closes between us." Charlotte Ramsey did not look away. She did not perform surprise because he suspected she was not entirely surprised, and she was honest enough not to pretend otherwise. What moved across her face was something tender and certain and bright. "I have been in love with you," she said, "since you came back with pine nuts because you remembered something I said once on a trail." She smiled, and it was full and real. "But I think it started when you sat down without saying a word." He reached out and took her hand, which he had not done before, and she let him hold it, and they stood there on the school steps in the cold afternoon light with the storm building over the mountains. And Reuben Sutton thought that 4 months was a very long time to wait, and also that he would wait it with every good intention, because Charlotte Ramsey was worth any distance. He kissed her then because it seemed like the moment that had always been preparing for itself, and it was the kind of kiss that was entirely unhurried and entirely certain, and she kissed him back with equal certainty, her hand rising to the lapel of his coat, and when they separated they stood close for a moment in the quiet, and the first flake of snow drifted down between them like punctuation. "Write to me," she said. "Every chance I get," he said. The winter was long. He expected that. He had wintered in the high country before and understood its terms. The world contracted to the cabin and the immediate woods, the trap line that must be checked regardless of cold, the evenings by the fire that were solitary and complete in a way that had always satisfied him. This winter was different only in that the satisfaction was attended by a particular longing he had not had before, a steady warm ache in the direction of the Carson Valley below. He wrote letters to Charlotte, 6 of them through November and December, and received 4 from her in return. Her letters were exactly what he might have predicted: full, precise, and vivid, written in a clear hand with very little wasted space. She wrote about Thomas, who by December was sitting up most of the day and had begun to argue about going back to the mine, which the doctor was resisting and Charlotte was forbidding. She wrote about the children in the school, each one sketched briefly in a sentence or two, and from those sentences he built a clear picture of each child. She wrote about a snowstorm in early December that had filled the street to window height, and the entire town had spent 2 days digging out, and how Ingrid Sahlberg had appeared at her door with coffee and an elk stew, and they had been confined together for 24 hours and had talked themselves thoroughly acquainted. She wrote at the end of her December letter one sentence that he read more than once in the firelight. "I think about you every evening when the lamps go down, and it is a comfortable thing and also an aching one, and I believe that is what love is supposed to feel like when it is real." He wrote back, "I believe you are right. That is exactly what it feels like." He came down the mountain in late February, earlier than he had originally planned, because the winter broke 2 weeks ahead of usual, and the trail was passable, and because after 4 months on the mountain with Charlotte Ramsey's letters and the fire and the long evenings, Reuben Sutton understood with complete and unsentimental clarity that he did not want to live his life at a distance from her anymore. He had been thinking, in the particular serious way he thought about things, about what that meant practically. He was not a man who dissolved himself into another person's life. He was not made for a town in the way she was. But he had sat with the question through the winter, the way he sat with most important questions, quietly and without forcing them, and what had emerged was not a compromise but an expansion. The cabin was a day's ride from Genoa. A good horse, not a mule, could do it in less. The school was Charlotte's and the town was becoming hers, and Thomas was there, and the mountain was his. These things did not have to be at war with each other. They could be held by 2 people together in a way that neither could hold alone. He arrived in Genoa on a Tuesday in late February, the mountain air still in his coat, and went directly to the school. He arrived just as the children were being let out for midday, and Charlotte came out with them, shepherding them toward the yard, and she saw him across the fence and stopped as completely as a person stops when they see something they were not expecting and then recognize it as the thing they most wanted. She walked to the fence, and he was on the other side of it, and they looked at each other through the wooden rails. "February," she said. "Late February," he said. "I told you February at the earliest." "You did," she agreed. Her eyes were bright. "You look like I came off a mountain in winter," he supplied. "Like you came back," she said. He opened the gate and came through, and the 12 children in the schoolyard were watching with unabashed interest from various positions, and he was aware of them but not deterred by them. He stood in front of Charlotte and held her face in his hands and kissed her properly, which he had been waiting 4 months to do, and she wrapped one hand in his coat and kissed him back. And from the schoolyard there was a collective sound from 12 children that ranged from disgusted to delighted depending on the age. "Class is not yet dismissed for lunch," Charlotte said against his mouth with a smile. "Then I will wait," he said. He waited on the school steps, and she taught the afternoon session, and he sat in the sun and thought about what he had come to say. Thomas came by at 2 in the afternoon, walking with more steadiness than the last time Reuben had seen him, color better, the sunken look of serious illness beginning to fill back in. They sat together on the steps for an hour and talked about the winter and the spring and the mining claim, which Thomas had decided to sell for whatever it would bring, and about the future in general terms. "You look like a man who has decided something," Thomas said at one point. "I have," Reuben said. Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Then she is the best person I know," he said. "I do not say that as a brother, I say it as someone who has watched her navigate this winter with extraordinary grace. She deserves someone who knows what he wants." "I know what I want," Reuben said. "Good," said Thomas simply, and that was sufficient. After school, in the small house with the kettle on and the afternoon light coming through the clean windows, Reuben told Charlotte what he had been thinking. He laid it out directly, because that was the only way he knew how to lay things out, the practical reality of the cabin, the distance, the nature of his work, and what he thought could be built around and between those facts. He told her he was asking her not to abandon what she had built here but to add to it. He said that he would come down to Genoa as often as he reasonably could, which in the good months would be often, and that he would make the cabin into a place she could come to that could be as much hers as his. He said the valley and the mountain were both beautiful and different things, and he did not see why they had to choose. Then he said, "I want to marry you, Charlotte, if you will have me." She had been listening to all of it with her cup of coffee and her straight-back chair and her complete attention, and at the last sentence her expression did the thing it sometimes did, opened up, became entirely visible, showed him everything in it. "You have been thinking this through all winter," she said. "All winter," he confirmed. "You thought about all of it, the practical parts, the distances." "I did. And your conclusion is that it is workable." "My conclusion," he said, "is that I love you and that I want to be your husband, and that the practical parts are solvable because we are both competent people." He paused. "And my conclusion is also that I have been alone on a mountain for a decade, and I am profoundly tired of it, and not in a way that time or work will fix, but in the way that has a specific answer, and the answer is you." Charlotte Ramsey set down her coffee cup. She stood and came around the table to him, and he rose to meet her because he was a man who rose when the situation called for it, and she put both hands on the front of his coat and looked up at him. "Yes," she said. "The answer is yes, Reuben." He wrapped his arms around her and held her with the full strength of his arms. Gently, the way powerful things are gentle when they mean it, and she pressed her face into his chest, and they stayed like that for a while in the warm kitchen with the kettle steam rising and the afternoon sun moving across the floor. They were married in the small church in Genoa on the 15th of April, 1874, 6 weeks after Reuben came down the mountain. The ceremony was conducted by a minister who had only been in the territory 3 months and was still slightly startled by everything, which was appropriate because the congregation included Emilio Garcia and his wife, Ingrid Sahlberg, wearing a magnificent hat that she had shipped from San Francisco, 12 schoolchildren who had been given the afternoon off and who attended in states ranging from formal to barely contained. Thomas Ramsey standing straighter than he had in months and serving as Charlotte's witness, and an assortment of Genoa townspeople who had decided, in the way of small towns, that this marriage was interesting enough to attend uninvited. Reuben wore his good coat, which was dark wool, and which he had taken to Ingrid Sahlberg 3 days before the wedding because she had offered to press it. Charlotte wore a dress of ivory cotton with small embroidered flowers at the collar that Ingrid had helped her make, and she walked into the church with Thomas, and she was the most beautiful thing Reuben Sutton had ever seen, which was a significant claim in a life that had included mountain mornings and summer storms over the Sierra Nevada. He held her hand at the altar, and she looked at him steadily as she said her vows, and he looked at her with the same quality of entire presence he had always brought to the things that mattered most. And when the minister told him he could kiss his bride, he did so with appropriate decorum and inappropriate thoroughness. And Garcia started a round of applause, and the schoolchildren joined in with enthusiasm, and Thomas Ramsey stood beside them and looked like a man who had survived the winter and found it worth surviving. They spent that first spring in both places, exactly as Reuben had proposed. Charlotte kept her school and her small house in Genoa through the week, and on Friday afternoons Reuben would come down the trail and they would have the weekend, or Charlotte would ride up the mountain with him and spend several days at the cabin. And this worked because they were both independent enough to find the separation tolerable and genuinely delighted enough in each other's company to find the reunion sweet. The cabin, which had been a single utilitarian space built by a man who expected to live in it alone, underwent some changes. Not dramatic changes. Charlotte was not a woman who required drama in her living arrangements, but specific ones. A proper shelf for books, because they now had a combined library that filled 2 crates. A second chair by the fire. A garden patch to the east of the cabin door where Charlotte planted sage, a habit she had picked up from Ingrid, and also a determined attempt at kitchen herbs that struggled against the altitude but produced enough thyme and oregano to be encouraging. Reuben built a table wide enough to eat at comfortably and to spread a map on when he was planning his routes, and Charlotte sat across from him at it in the evenings and graded papers while he maintained his equipment, and neither of them found the silence between them empty. Thomas improved steadily through the spring, sold his mining claim in May for enough to clear his debts with a small remainder, and by June was working a part-time position with Garcia at the trading post, which suited his temperament. Thomas Ramsey was a social man at heart, and the trading post's steady stream of travelers and settlers gave him both company and purpose. His cough faded to an occasional roughness, and the doctor in June said that if he continued well through the summer, the prognosis was genuinely hopeful. Charlotte received this news with the kind of relief that lives deep in the body and only releases when the danger has truly passed, and Reuben held her that evening, while she let some of the worry she had been carrying finally go. Reuben extended his guiding work in the summer of 1874, taking on 2 survey parties through the high country north of his cabin, and 1 party of naturalists from a university in California who wanted to catalog the alpine wildflowers and were entirely unprepared for what that actually entailed. He was patient with them because patience was one of his particular strengths, and they found their flowers and they paid him fairly. And by the end of the summer he had enough additional income to consider some improvements to both the cabin and his equipment. Charlotte had a moment, that summer, with Councilman Barrow that nearly ended her contract at the school. Barrow had recruited a school board member to formally complain that Charlotte's curriculum was too focused on what he called Eastern ideas and insufficiently focused on the practical skills that settlers needed. Charlotte had appeared before the school committee with a written defense of her curriculum that was 22 pages long, which she had written at the kitchen table in Genoa over the course of 3 evenings, while Reuben read beside her and occasionally said things like, "That paragraph is very good," and I would not use the word erroneous twice in one page. She had presented her defense with the precise, composed energy of a woman who had been underestimated before and found it motivating rather than discouraging. The committee, which included Garcia and 4 others, voted 4-1 in her favor. The one was Barrow himself. Garcia had taken Reuben aside afterward and said, with evident satisfaction, "That woman is a force of nature." Reuben had said, "I know," with a quietness that made Garcia laugh. Autumn came in, and with it the beauty of the high country that Reuben had always loved, the aspens going gold above the pine line, the mornings sharp and clean, the smell of the first frost on the sage, the elk moving through the meadows below the cabin in the late afternoons. Charlotte came up the mountain in October for 2 weeks, because the school was between sessions for a harvest break and Thomas was well enough to be left without worry, and she and Reuben spent those 2 weeks in the high country together. He showed her things he had not shown anyone. The place above the ridge where you could see, on a clear day, both the valley floor and the distant glint of the Carson River to the east. The stand of ancient juniper on the north slope that had been there, by his estimate, longer than the Nevada territory itself. The meadow to the south where the deer came at dawn, moving through the fog like quiet thoughts. She received all of it with the particular quality of attention that she brought to everything worth attending to, and she asked questions and made observations, and once, sitting on the ridge above everything, said, "I understand now why you stayed." "And," he said. "And I understand why you came down," she said, and she took his hand and leaned her head against his shoulder in the mountain quiet. In January of 1875, Charlotte discovered she was with child. She told Reuben on a Saturday morning in the Genoa house when the street outside was quiet under new snow, and he sat with that information for a moment in the way he sat with important things, and then he stood up from the table and came around it and held her with his whole heart in his arms, and Charlotte pressed her face into the warmth of his neck and felt, more completely than she had felt anything in recent memory, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "A little," she said honestly. "Are you?" "A little," he said, and also he stopped, searching for the right word, and also, she prompted. "Complete," he said, "more complete than I knew was possible." The pregnancy was managed between the 2 locations, a question of logistics that they approached with their characteristic practicality. Charlotte continued teaching until June, when she and Reuben agreed that she should come up to the cabin for the final months, and that he would be present when the baby came, and that they would bring the doctor from Genoa up when the time arrived. They arranged this with Dr. Marsh, a capable and unflappable man who had delivered babies in circumstances considerably more remote than this. Thomas came up the mountain to stay at the cabin for the last 2 weeks of the pregnancy, which Charlotte had not asked for but was glad of, because it meant both of the people she most wanted near were there. The 3 of them filled the cabin with a quiet, purposeful warmth, and in the evenings Thomas and Reuben played cards and argued about card games, and Charlotte sat near the fire with her book and listened to the 2 of them with deep contentment. The baby came in early August of 1875, a boy, strong and loud, with Reuben's dark coloring and what Thomas swore were Charlotte's strong opinions, expressed at full volume from his first minutes in the world. They named him James William Sutton, James for Charlotte's father, William for Reuben's elder brother who had died young and whom Reuben had loved. Reuben held his son for the first time with the careful, reverent steadiness of a man who had handled fragile things before but never anything this irreplaceable, and Charlotte watched him holding the baby and saw something on her husband's face that she had not seen before, not the quiet strength and the steady warmth and the watchful eyes she had come to love absolutely, but underneath all of that, laid bare, a tenderness so complete it was almost difficult to look at directly. "Hello," Reuben said to his son, in the same quiet way he had once sat down beside a crying woman at the edge of a trail, just present, just entirely there. James William Sutton, in the manner of newborns, said nothing whatsoever in reply, which Reuben would later say made him feel entirely at home. They settled in the years that followed into a life that was both full and steady, built from the actual materials of what they were and what they loved. Charlotte returned to the school in September of that year, bringing James with her to Genoa, and Ingrid Sahlberg, who had been waiting for exactly this development with barely concealed anticipation, became the child's devoted honorary grandmother in a way that was so immediate and enthusiastic that it forestalled any formal discussion of the arrangement. Reuben came down the mountain for longer stretches now, and he found that Genoa suited him better than he had expected, which he attributed partly to Charlotte and partly to the fact that he had never before had a reason to stay long enough to find out whether he liked a place. He became a person the town recognized and relied upon in his quiet way, the man who solved problems that required physical competence and stubborn patience, who could track a lost horse across 3 miles of sage flats or rig a bridge repair over a flash-flooded creek, or navigate the high country in early winter to reach an injured miner's camp. He was not a social man in the conventional sense, but he was a trustworthy one, and in the Carson Valley in the 1870s trustworthiness was the more valuable currency. Thomas recovered fully by the summer of 1876, which the doctor described as better than expected, and which Charlotte described as exactly what she had insisted upon, and which Thomas himself described as entirely his own doing, with minimal help from the nagging of his sister or the steady, watchful presence of his brother-in-law, who he thought was excellent even though he said so very rarely, and in terms of such economy that it barely qualified as speech. Thomas had, by that point, decided to stay in Genoa permanently, and had become Garcia's full partner in the trading post, which suited both of them and gave Thomas the social commerce he needed to be happy. James, when he was old enough to be carried on Reuben's back on the mountain trails, became a fixture of those expeditions with his dark eyes wide and his small hands gripping Reuben's collar. He would grow, in time, into a boy who was as comfortable in the high country as in the valley below, who knew the names of birds and could read, whether coming off the peaks, and was also, thanks to his mother, the best reader in his school, and the kind of child who was curious about everything in a way that suggested he would spend his whole life finding questions more interesting than answers. Charlotte had her second child in the spring of 1878, a girl they named Ruth Eleanor, who came into the world with considerably more patience than her brother, and who would become, in due course, a person of remarkable steadiness and private humor. And then in 1881, a second boy, Daniel Thomas, the middle name for Thomas, who received this information at the trading post from Reuben and said absolutely nothing for a full 30 seconds and then said, "I will be godfather," which had always been the plan but which Thomas stated as though he had just decided it, which was fine. In the winter of 1882, Reuben built a house. Not the cabin stayed. He would always keep the cabin. It was as much a part of him as his hands, but a proper house at the edge of Genoa, in the direction of the mountain, with a south-facing porch and a big kitchen, and rooms enough for 3 children, because Charlotte had mentioned, with a speculative quality he recognized by now as a reliable indicator of her intentions, that 3 felt like a beginning rather than an end. He built it from timber he milled himself, using the skills he had accumulated across a lifetime of making things from what the land provided. And Charlotte designed the interior rooms with the focused practicality of a woman who had thought carefully about how light moved through windows and where a person most naturally wanted to sit in the morning. It took him 1 summer to build the frame and 1 fall to close it in, and they moved in that December. And on the first night in the new house, they sat on the south porch in heavy coats and blankets with the cold desert sky above them, and 3 sleeping children inside, and Thomas down the street at the house. He had built himself with some of the trading post profits, and the lights of Genoa warm in the darkness, and the mountains above them in the starlight. "Do you remember," Charlotte said, "what you said when I asked why you were helping me, that first day?" "I said I wanted to know how it turned out," he said. "I have been thinking about that," she said. "It is funny. People say things like that, 'I want to see how it ends,' as though the end is the point. Is it not?" he asked. "No," she said simply. "I think the point is every Tuesday at the school when one of the children understands something for the first time and looks up with that particular expression. I think it is the morning we found the grizzly tracks above the East Ridge, and you read them like a book. I think it is Thomas at the trading post telling everyone he meets about Nevada as though he discovered it personally." She paused. "I think the point is all the parts, not the ending." Reuben was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars. Then I suppose I am glad I sat down," he said. She laughed softly and leaned against him, and he put his arm around her and held her against his side in the cold night, the way he had not been able to do that first evening on the trail when she was a stranger, and he was just a man who understood that sometimes what a person needed was presence, without demand or explanation. He had sat down beside her without a word, because he had recognized something in her that he had in himself, the particular kind of person who holds up under weight that would break others, who moves forward through grief and difficulty, not because they are not feeling it, but because they have decided that stopping is not acceptable. He had recognized it and respected it and been drawn to it, and everything that had followed, the trunk in the ravine, the pine nuts, the letters through the winter, the vows in the small church, the children, the house, the life that was larger than anything he had planned when he was a man on a mountain who believed he preferred solitude. All of it had followed from that first quiet act of sitting down. He had found her at the edge of a trail with everything falling apart, and he had not fixed it immediately, and he had not explained what to do, and he had not made himself the center of the story. He had just sat beside her and let her know that she was not alone. And that, as it turned out, had been exactly enough to begin. The years passed with the rhythmic assurance of seasons in the high desert, full and various and occasionally dramatic, as the West demanded, but grounded in the particular stability of a life built by two people who understood both themselves and each other and had chosen, with full knowledge, to be chosen. The school Charlotte built in Genoa over the following decade became something of a model for the territory, with a curriculum that balanced the practical and the academic, and a reputation for turning out children who could read and reason, and were not afraid of ideas. Councilman Barrow retired from public life in 1880, largely voluntarily, and was replaced by a woman named Sullivan who immediately expressed enthusiastic support for the school, which Charlotte accepted with gracious satisfaction. Reuben continued guiding through the high country into the 1880s, shifting as the territory changed from fur trade routes to the new business of geological survey and the early work of the U.S. Land Office, whose young surveyors needed men who knew the mountain ranges with first-hand precision. He was known throughout the Carson Valley and the Sierra Nevada foothills as a man who could find any pass and read any terrain, and who kept his word on a contract without variation. He carried this reputation with the same quiet ease with which he carried everything, as a matter of course rather than accomplishment. James, at 12, could trap and track and navigate by stars, and was also reading Dickens by lamplight, both inheritances honored. Ruth, at 9, was already helping Charlotte in the schoolroom on Saturday mornings, possessed of a natural gift for explanation and a patience with younger children that her mother recognized as a genuine vocation. Daniel, at 5, was a whirlwind of cheerful determination who had fallen off the porch roof, the corral fence, and 3 separate pieces of furniture, and had survived all of these events with the unimpressed resilience of someone who considers gravity primarily an interesting challenge. Thomas Ramsey, in good health now for years, married a woman named Elena Vega in 1880, a Spanish-Californian woman who had come to Nevada territory with her brother, a silversmith. She was a calm, quick-witted woman who managed Thomas's social energy with affectionate efficiency and became a genuine friend to Charlotte, who had been hoping for exactly this development since Thomas had mentioned Alina's name 3 times in one conversation, the previous autumn, without appearing to notice he had done so. The world outside the Carson Valley was changing with the pace that the latter half of the 19th century seemed to demand, railroads pushing further into the territory, new settlements rising along the river valleys, the old patterns of the frontier giving way degree by degree to something more settled and more complicated. Reuben watched this change with the observant calm of a man who had always known that the wilderness he loved was temporary in the historical sense, that what he had was a window of time in a particular place, not an indefinite condition. He made his peace with this easily because the things he valued most were not the wilderness itself, but what it had given him: the clarity, the competence, the understanding of himself as a man who could build and sustain and protect and love. He still went to the cabin above the valley every few months, sometimes with Charlotte and the children, sometimes alone, and those solitary weeks in the high country were still necessary and still good, and he came back from them each time with the particular quality of presence that deep solitude provides to those who use it well. Charlotte had come to understand this about him, and did not begrudge it and did not need to, because he always came back with the same gravitational certainty that he had always brought to her entirely himself, entirely hers. On an evening in 1884, when the October aspen were at their peak gold above the Nevada hills and the air had that first whisper of real cold in it, Charlotte and Reuben sat on the porch of their house in Genoa, as they often did in the evenings when the children were in bed. She had a shawl around her shoulders and a letter from one of her former students in Carson City, now studying at a college in California, which she had read twice already. He had his pipe, which he smoked with characteristic infrequency and ceremony, and his Emerson, much battered now from a decade of reading. Henry Caldwell got into the college in San Francisco, Charlotte said, the engineering program. He is the first student I ever taught who, she stopped, and her voice had a quality that was proud and touched at once. You are responsible for that, Reuben said. He is responsible for it, she corrected. You gave him the tools, Reuben said, in the tone that meant the discussion was concluded in the only sensible way. Charlotte smiled and looked out at the darkening street, and then she said in a tone that was speculative in exactly the way he knew, I have been thinking. I know, he said. You cannot know I have not said anything yet. You have that particular look, he said. She turned to him, and even in the dim porch light he could see the amusement in her face. What look? The one that means something has been decided and you are deciding how to present it, he said. She laughed, which was his favorite sound, had been his favorite sound for 10 years. I think, she said, that I would like to have one more child. He looked at her in the lamplight that fell through the window, his wife of 10 years with the gray that had come into her dark hair at the temples, and the fine lines at the corners of her eyes from smiling in the mountain sun. Still Charlotte, still the most particular and essential person he had ever encountered. And he said, with the same directness he had always brought to the things that mattered, I would like that too. And so the family grew, and the years continued, and the Carson Valley went through its seasons with the steady magnificence of a landscape that does not require permission from anyone. And the town of Genoa grew gradually from a weathered frontier settlement into something that had permanence and character and history layered into its foundations. In 1887, Reuben Sutton walked the trail above the Carson Valley for the first time in several years, just himself and Talbert's successor, a considerably more agreeable mule named Augustus, and he came around the bend above the ravine where Charlotte had been sitting 11 years before, and he stopped at that exact spot and looked down at the edge of the trail where she had been, and he remembered the sound of her weeping carrying through the mountain air, and how he had known without analysis that the right thing to do was to sit down. He thought about all of it, the trunk, the pine nuts, the winter letters, the church in April with the sun through the plain windows and Charlotte in ivory cotton, the first time he held James, the house he had built timber by timber, the school and Thomas and Ingrid Sahlberg's magnificent hat, and 11 years of mornings waking beside the person who had changed the entire shape of what his life was and meant. He sat down at the edge of the trail, where she had sat, just for a moment, and looked out across the valley where the silver thread of the Carson River caught the afternoon light, and the distant town of Genoa was a cluster of warm shapes against the vast neutrality of the Sage Flats. And he felt, as he sometimes felt in the high country, the particular variety of gratitude that has no object and requires no expression. The gratitude that is simply the body's recognition that it is exactly where it should be. He had come around a bend in the trail and found her, and he had sat down, and that had been the beginning of everything, and everything that had followed had been worth every mile of it. He stood, gathered Augustus's lead, and turned back toward home. There was a fourth child born in the spring of 1888, another boy, whom they named after a long discussion in which Charlotte proposed several names and Reuben listened and then said simply, "What about Reuben?" And Charlotte had looked at him for a moment and then said that was the best name she had heard yet. So the youngest Sutton was named Reuben Thomas, called Thomas by the family to avoid confusion, though he would grow into a person who resolved the confusion on his own terms the way the youngest children of determined families often do, by becoming unmistakably himself. Charlotte taught at the Genoa school until 1891, when the territory became a state and the new school district reorganized, and she moved into the position of district curriculum director, which meant she spent her time helping other teachers rather than teaching children directly, which she found simultaneously satisfying and occasionally lonely for the classroom. Reuben observed this over the first year and then built, onto the east side of their house, a room with good window light and proper bookshelves, which he presented to her as a study, and which she used to write the curriculum materials that, over the following years, circulated through schools across Nevada and California, and were used by teachers who had never met the woman who wrote them but who taught better for having them. Thomas Ramsey and Alina had 3 children of their own. The trading post became one of the most prosperous businesses in the Carson Valley region, and Thomas, who had come to Nevada to dig silver out of the ground and failed, built his prosperity from the more sustainable material of being genuinely good company to every human being who walked through his door. Ingrid Sahlberg lived into her 90s, attended every Sutton family event from baptisms to school graduations with her various magnificent hats, and was generally regarded as an institution. James Sutton, at 18, told his father that he wanted to go to the university in California, and Reuben, who had spent 18 years making sure his son had every tool he might need, said yes, and meant it completely, and only said once, as James was loading his horse for the first leg of the journey, "Write to your mother. Write often." James, who was sufficiently his mother's son to understand this meant write to both of them, wrote every week. Ruth became a teacher, as Charlotte had suspected she would, and took a school in Carson City at 21, and did there what Charlotte had done in Genoa, made it better by being entirely herself within it. Daniel remained close to home through his 20s, working with Reuben as a guide and trail scout, and was in many ways his father's echo, the same quiet competence, the same economy of speech, the same quality of presence that made people around him feel settled. He married a woman named Adiz, the daughter of a freedman family that had come west from Missouri in 1875, and they built a house 2 streets from the Suttons, and Charlotte taught her grandchildren in her study on Sunday mornings and found it the finest work she had ever done. Young Reuben Thomas, to the family, grew into a person who combined both his parents' qualities in a way that surprised everyone, including himself, becoming first a lawyer, then a judge in the Nevada courts, A man of precise speech and large conviction who was remembered for a quality of justice that was both rigorous and humane, which anyone who knew his parents would have recognized as entirely predictable. Reuben Sutton carried his years well, in the way of men who have spent their lives in physical work. He was broader and somewhat slower at 70 than he had been at 31, but the same essential quality was there, the watchfulness and the steadiness, and the silence that was not emptiness but presence. His hair had gone entirely gray by 60, and he wore it shorter than he had in the mountain years, but it was still his own. His hands had the kind of worn strength that spoke of decades of use. He and Charlotte still went up the mountain to the cabin every summer, just the two of them, for at least 2 weeks. The trail above the Carson Valley was an easier walk than it had been in 1873, improved by 30 years of increased traffic and some federal work on the switchbacks. But Reuben always knew the exact curve of the road where he had found her, and he always registered it as he passed, the way a man registers every place where his life bent permanently in a new direction. On the day that Reuben Sutton turned 70, his family gathered in Genoa in a way that required advanced coordination across 4 states and 2 countries, because James by then was in California and Ruth was in Carson City, and the grandchildren were everywhere that young people go. They filled the house and the yard and spilled over onto the street in front, and Charlotte made sure there was enough food. And Thomas Ramsey gave a speech that went on so long that Elena gently redirected him twice, and Daniel sat beside his father on the porch for most of the afternoon in the comfortable silence of people who share a language built from years of the same mountains. Late in the evening, when the guests had shifted to the various houses and bedrooms and floors where people sleep when family descends, Charlotte found Reuben on the south porch, as she often found him, looking at the stars above the Sierra Nevada with his hands loose on his knees. She brought 2 cups of coffee and sat beside him, and they sat without speaking for a while, the way they often did, not because they had nothing to say, but because some evenings the silence was itself the thing they were sharing, and it was enough. 70 years, she said eventually. It went quickly, he said, which surprised her slightly because he had always seemed so unhurried. The good parts always do, she said. He turned to look at her in the lamplight from the house window, and she was 63, and she was still Charlotte, still the woman who had shaken his hand at the edge of a Nevada trail and said her name as though she meant to keep going. He had loved her for 4 decades, and the love had not simplified with time but had deepened, adding new chambers the way a house does when the family it contains requires more room, until it was large enough to hold everything. The arguments, the griefs, the quiet mornings and the difficult winters and the 4 children and the school and the mountain and the vast, steady, ordinary miracle of a life built together. I am grateful, he said, with the economy of a man for whom words were always chosen carefully, for every single day of it. Charlotte covered his hand with hers on the arm of the porch chair, and they sat together in the Nevada night with the stars above the mountains they had loved and the town they had shaped, and the family that had grown from the simple, unlikely fact of a man who sat down beside a woman at the edge of a trail without saying a word, because he had understood that what she needed first was someone to be there. It had been, from that moment to this, the right thing to do, and it always would be.